Thank you, Letitia. Well, why don't we get started? Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is a unique opportunity and experience for all of us, and this is part of a series that the Calgary Adapted Hub, powered by Jumpstart, initiated it a few years ago as a seminar series. And the Calgary Adapted Hub, for those who I have not met, is co-chaired by myself. I'm David Legg, and Dr. Carolyn Emery, who's online with us here. So I'm a faculty member at Mount Royal University, and Dr. Emery is a faculty member at the University of Calgary. And part of the Calgary Adapted Hub, powered by Jumpstart's mandate and vision is to connect practice and research with practice. And so these seminar series were launched a number of years ago. And Eli Wolff, who we're going to be speaking about in this presentation, was one of our first speakers going back a couple of years ago. And we have decided to rename these seminar series the Calgary Adapted Hub Seminar Series in memory of Eli Wolff. And so we've dedicated today's session to kick off the renaming of the seminar series. And we thought, what better way to do that than to speak to Eli's legacy and impact on us as individuals and collectively to the movement of adapted physical activity, sport, and recreation for persons with impairment, persons with disability. And we wanted to start the session today by taking together, and thank you to Jen, Ashley, and Letitia for putting this together. We've pieced together parts of the seminar series that Eli presented a few years ago. And for those of you who don't know, Eli passed at the age of 45, and this would have been in late April when he passed. So it's been a few months now since his passing, and over that time we've talked and considered about ways that we can respect and recognize his impact and legacy. And this was one very small way that we wanted to do it here at the Calgary Adapted Hub, powered by Jumpstart, of which he was also a member of our advisory committee since its inception. So Letitia, if I can get you to play the compilation that we've put together, and then once that's done, I'll have a chance to introduce our two guests that are very close friends and colleagues of Eli's, and we're going to spend the next hour talking about his impact on us as individuals, and then also collectively. And then at the end, if time permitting, we'll have an opportunity for comments and questions. And again, I would also encourage you, if you so choose, to leave any comments in the chat function, which would be at the bottom of the page on your Zoom slides. So Letitia, if I can ask you to play our compilation.
You know, with sports, it was always such a place of, you know, I just felt I was free and I could really be in the zone, and I just like flow state oftentimes achieving that with regard to sport. And most of my experiences were with kids without disabilities all the way through. And then I only heard about the Paralympics when I was at a boarding school in high school. There was a local rehabilitation center. I was doing some volunteer work, and I started to hear about the Paralympics. And then I got involved, and I started to just experience the Paralympic movement in soccer for athletes with cerebral palsy and stroke survivors. And for me, for some reason, there was just, as much as I enjoyed the soccer, I also just became vividly like conscious of some of the disparities of equity and inclusion, and felt like there was just so much segregation that was taking place, and just felt like the experience of the disabled athlete was just so isolated. And for some reason, I just couldn't always like pinpoint it or articulate it. I just felt it. And it was just sort of this feeling that that wasn't quite right. It's been a powerful message for me about activism, because sometimes we do get caught up in the tactics and the specific strategies of activism, but in many ways it's more about the overall approach. It's always been a powerful message for me about, and I think it says a lot about the challenges we face, that oftentimes, you know, what's not being said or what's behind closed doors or in emails that you may never see. And that these are part of the challenges we have seen with including and integrating Olympians and Paralympians together, have been just some of the resistance, some of the challenges of Olympians accepting Paralympians, Paralympians accepting Olympians, how to kind of work more holistically together. And so this was an effort of just on the alumni front. And so fast forward in 2019, some of the work that Sherry may have touched on, with equal pay, the name change. But back in 2013, there was resistance, and some of it was really unspoken. But yeah, I mean, hopefully, you know, for me, the connection points, and really thinking about Brown versus Board of Education and the foundation it laid and how it resonates and what it means to bring those concepts forward, not only into education, but into sports, into all these different dimensions. But also this whole concept of bringing voice, like how do we, you know, express our views, being willing to propose an idea, suggest change. I mean, I think all these are really vital. So I just wanted to say thank you. I know we only have a few minutes. I'm sorry I probably got carried away a little bit, but I'm happy to stick around a bit for any questions or just to open it up. But thank you, David, and thank you to the team.
Eli, thank you. I think your grandfather, Payson Wolff, would be very proud of you, and would be very pleased to see that you have continued in his work of, you know, all deliberate speed as far as inclusion and advocacy, and just the opportunities for persons living with disability, particularly in sport and recreation. I've had the pleasure of working with you and with Dr. Fay and Dr. Humse, you made reference to, since 2004. It's been one of the greatest pleasures and privileges of my professional life and now personal life. I consider you to be a very good friend. So this has been really.
Thank you, Letitia, for playing that. So as the slide notes, Eli passed on April the 4th, so not in late April as I had noted. So I've known Eli since 2004, when I had a chance to visit him in Boston, when he was working at Northeastern University, and I was on a sabbatical at Dalhousie University at the time in Halifax. And I'll have a chance to speak a little bit about my own experiences and recollections of Eli and the impact and the connection that he's had with me. But before I get to that, I want to introduce our two guests that are here today to kind of help me share in the recollection and the recognition and the honor of Eli. The first is Amy Karageorgis Farkas, who's joining us from, Amy, I think you're in Massachusetts right now, but I could be wrong. Am I close? The Eastern Seaboard, at least?
I'm in Rhode Island.
Rhode Island. So Amy's joining us from Rhode Island, and Mary Holmes is joining us from Louisville today. And perhaps what I'll do is just to start, Mary, I'll ask you to go first, and really what I'm wanting you to do just to begin this conversation is talk a little bit about how you knew and know Eli, where that connection came from. And then Amy, I'll get you to do the same. And then I want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the contributions and the varied interests that Eli had, that many people, and I'm still continuing to learn about, some of the contributions in the areas that he was involved in, even since his passing. But Mary, I'll ask you to go first to talk a little bit about your connection to Eli.
All right. Well, good afternoon or good morning, wherever everybody is joining us today. Thank you so much, David, for inviting me to be a part of this with the Calgary Adapted Hub, and now doing this in honor of Eli. I have to step back for just a moment and reflect on hearing and seeing Eli again in the video, because that really, yeah, I'll have this with me. I admit it. How did I meet? Well, I'm a professor of sport administration, first of all, at the University of Louisville, and my research really focuses on, and my advocacy focuses on sport for people with disabilities, and also sport and human rights. I've worked for Paralympic Games and won Olympic Games, Pan American Games, so I have experience in that way. Just that's a little bit of my background, but in terms of how I met Eli, should we start there? Is that, David, what you'd like?
Please.
Is that a good place to start? And I always tell it this way, and it always sounds kind of, I don't want to say creepy, but I met Eli online. So now don't go there. Okay, but the way I say I met him online is that Eli was at the time working on his senior honors thesis at Brown University. So he was a senior undergraduate student at Brown University, and his project dealt with disability sport, and particularly disability soccer, which we know that Eli was, of course, representing the United States at 2 Paralympic Games in football and soccer. And he was looking for people to work with them, or somebody who had sort of common interests, because there aren't very many of us, particularly in sport management, that look at this particular area. And so that was how he made the connection. He apparently saw some of my work, and in typical Eli fashion, reached out to someone he didn't know. He was never afraid to do that, was he? He was great at making connections. And so I actually worked with him online, and this was before Zoom, so I didn't even know what the guy looked like, but we worked together on that project, and then eventually I met him after a year or so, I think, up at Boston when he was working with Northeastern University up there. And then ever since then, so that would have been, all right, the year 2000, I believe. I want to get that right. I think that's when he graduated, either 2000, 2001. The bottom line, I've had the great fortune to work with him for over 20 years. And we've had lots of adventures together, done a lot of research, a lot of writing, advocacy work. And he truly was an inspiration to me in my thinking. And I realize that even more now that he's left us. So anyway, that's how I met him, and we've worked together, presented together, written together, all those things that academics do. But I always say this about Eli: the disability sport community, when he passed, we lost an incredible advocate, didn't we? We really did. I lost a friend, and that, I think, sums it up. It really does. So I'll stop there, and I guess you want to move to Amy.
Please. Yeah. So Amy. Yeah, talk a little bit about how you first met Eli and kind of where that relationship developed, and then what I'll do is I'll then kind of add my story to it too, to try and connect all the different dots. And by doing this, we're going to paint a picture of who Eli was and the contributions he made, and then we'll talk maybe a little bit more about some of the specific initiatives that he focused on. So Amy, over to you.
Thank you. Can you see my video?
No.
Yeah, I can't either. But it says.
Oh no, sorry. Like I can see you now.
No, that's what I meant. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, because I can't see myself. Which is going to make me think I'm not on camera.
Well, you are, so don't anything you'll regret.
So I knew there would be a video, but I didn't realize it. So I'm not prepared mentally for this, but thank you for letting me join you. I'm going to speak. I will get my breath together. I want to say thank you for putting this together, and thank you for sharing his voice, which I hadn't heard. I also want to say thank you to his mother, who has joined us, who created a wonderful human being that we get to honor today. So thank you so much for joining us. I promise I will stop crying. So in a nutshell, Eli and I are the same age. We graduated from college the same time, and we both wanted to go out into the world and make an impact on disability, in the world of disability. And neither one of us knew exactly what that looked like, but I ended up at what's called, or was called, the U.S. National Center for Physical Activity and Disability. It's now a slightly different name, and it was hosted at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I was an information specialist right out of college, and I manned a hotline, 800 number, where anyone could call with any question. And one of the first days on the job, I got a phone call from Eli. I have no idea what he asked at this point because I have a terrible memory. But it was like the shortest and longest conversation ever because it went by so fast, but it never really ended. And I say that because he probably called and emailed once a week for the rest of my year and a half there. He just had this way of connecting, and so we connected and we started working on projects together from day one. And he just reached out saying, "Look, I'm interested in this topic. I have a disability. I am an athlete. Whatever I can do to help, I'll do for you as a center." And so we did. We brought him in as much as we could to work on things with us. And the other way that I know Eli is through his athletics, because I was based in Chicago and the U.S. soccer team is, or the U.S. Soccer Association is based in Chicago, and they'd have a lot of their trainings in Chicago for the national team. And therefore I got to know him as an athlete at the time as well. So that's how I know Eli.
Thank you, Amy. So I'll speak a little bit about how I kind of got to know him and my path, and then we'll come back and we'll spend some time talking about the various initiatives and the projects and the advocacy streams that Eli was involved in. So I mentioned at the outset that I met him officially and formally for the first time in 2004. And I had received a letter on Northeastern letterhead somehow. I think it was just more of a newsletter at the time, but it was the creation of a center at Northeastern. And I should also have mentioned that Dr. Ted Fay was invited to speak on this as well, but was unable to join us at the last minute. And Ted's connected to this story as well. So I knew Ted through sport management, and I knew Mary through sport management initiatives through NASM, the North American Society for Sport Management. And there were not a lot of academics in sport management that had an interest in adapted physical activity and disability sports. So we connected rather easily, I suspect, and would get to know each other. And then through that, I think, is how I got connected to this center at Northeastern. And so I received this note, and I was in Halifax at the time. And so again, this is the early 2000s. It was a relatively easy connection to come down to Boston. And I reached out to Eli, had never met him, introduced myself to him. And I can't remember if it was by email at that time in the early 2000s, but it was most likely by letter or phone. Anyhow, he invited me down. Sight unseen. I had not met him. I didn't really know who he was. And I agreed to come down. And then he asked me if I wanted to stay at his place. And he was living in, I want to say, Little Jamaica. I can't remember the name of the neighborhood in Boston, but it was near Fenway Park. And he invited me to come stay with him. And I remember talking to my wife and explaining to her that this was what I was going to do. She goes, "Well, who is this guy?" I'm like, "I don't really know. But he just seems like the nicest guy." And I described a little bit that I knew about him, and she was like, "Well, okay." So anyways, I arrived in Boston and had just a marvelous weekend with him. And it was actually the marathon weekend, the Boston Marathon weekend. And he was a bit of a rock star, I guess, in some respects. I mean, he just knew everybody. And he was constantly, like, to go anywhere with him would take hours because he just would know people. And he would always engage and chat with people. Anyways, I fell in love with him. And a relationship developed and a friendship developed and evolved over time, both professionally, but from my perspective, what I'm going to speak to more personally. And so I have 3 sons who are all in their 20s right now. And as Eli and I got to know each other, we would have these Zoom calls. And I can just remember, I would take them in the basement and our boys would come down and they'd be like, who are you talking to? Who are you talking to? Well, it's my friend Eli. That's how they know him, is my friend Eli. I think that they think that's his whole name, my friend Eli. And so they would come on and they'd be in the back jumping around. And Eli just would laugh and laugh and laugh at me as I'm trying to have a serious conversation with him about some project or some initiative that we're working on. And my kids are just destroying the back of the room. And he absolutely loved it. And then when he became a father himself, with his two little kids now, and this just this gorgeous family, I just got such a kick out of him and the pictures that he would post, and just the joy that he had in being a dad, and talking about his kids and the pictures that he would post. To me, that's where I connected with him, was on that relationship side, and just the shared joy that we had in being dads at different kind of times in our own journey as being fathers. So that's a little bit about how I got to know Eli, and we'll certainly touch on a number of more of his professional contributions and accolades and connections. But that's kind of the way I got to know him. So let's talk now about his varied contributions and streams of influence. And it was, as I was preparing for this presentation, I started thinking about all the places and ways in which he touched kind of both sport as a whole, and then more specifically disability sport. And you talked about him just as a Paralympian in and of itself. And so competing in I think it was the 96 and then 2000 games, I think you said, Mary. So in Atlanta and Sydney, right?
96 and 2004.
Oh, in 2004 in Athens, that's right. So those two games, and it was in soccer. And so that just in and of itself is a stream. But then the advocacy piece. And so, you think about his work with Principle 6, with the IOC or the United Nations or the ESPY Awards. I think I was mentioning earlier, I was at an event in Colorado Springs in May that the Aspen Institute had hosted, and they had a moment of silence for him at the start of the conference. I had no idea he was connected to the Aspen Institute. And so, I keep learning about all these different places that he played in and had influence on, and made contributions to. That again, he was perhaps the most humble person I had met. And he didn't brag. There was no bravado. There was no bragging about it. He simply just wanted to make a contribution and be a change agent. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about all these places that he made these various contributions. And so Mary or Amy, I won't pick on either of you to start, but if either of you want to just kind of pick one that kind of comes top to mind, and we'll just kind of go through some of these areas, just again to highlight and just to kind of pay respect to the contributions that he made. So again, Amy or Mary, I'll ask one of the two of you to maybe start.
Oh, if it's okay, Amy, I'll go ahead. Okay. One of the first sort of biggest projects that I was able to work with Eli on, it was more about making a connection with him and for someone else, was the Casey Martin case. And Casey Martin, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, Casey Martin was a professional golfer, PGA golfer, and he has a disability, a mobility disability that impairs circulatory, I think, in the legs, that impairs his ability to walk. And of course, if you're a professional golfer, you got to walk the course, right? Well, what Eli worked with Casey Martin was Casey Martin wanted to say, hey, can I use a cart? Can I use a golf cart? And he met with, so he brought that forward. Of course, the PGA challenged. It goes up through the courts. It gets all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And this is where, again, so he was, aware of what was going on. But Eli needed some help, and he needed some people in the legal sport law community to help. And I have a colleague by the name of Anita Mormon, who is our sport law person. And then another colleague, Lisa Pike Master Alexis, who's at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. They're both attorneys. And so I gave them his names. I think that's how he got their names, through me. I know I got Anita's that way. And engaged them in writing an amici brief, a friend of the court, I guess is what it means, on behalf of the disability sport organizations in the United States that supported Casey Martin. And so both of them were then able to, they had to get admitted to the bar of the Supreme Court. So they are, which is pretty cool when you go into somebody's office and you see that, right? And Anita's office is next door to mine at school. But anyway, Casey Martin wins. And it was just an amazing, really landmark case. But here was a case of Eli, bringing in two people he didn't know, Anita and Lisa, being able to elevate them and then get them interested in the area. In all the disability sport groups in the U.S., get them together to agree, and as did Anita and Lisa, to be part of the amici brief. And Casey Martin wins. So that was just amazing. And if I'm not mistaken, Eli got sort of tied into it because he randomly met, I think, one of Casey Martin's attorneys, like in an airport or something. And being Eli, talked to them, met them. Casey Martin wins. So that was that was really one of the biggest ones. I also had the great opportunity to work with him on with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 30.5, which was on sport and physical activity. I think it's under the sport and activity and culture section anyway, 30.5, working on that. And that was really a crown jewel for him to be able to do that. And I think Amy can speak more about that. She's very familiar with working in the United Nations realm. But it was one of those where, if you look up that convention, which was the first human rights convention of the 21st century, I believe, for the United Nations, you'll never see his name. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. He put his head down on the pillow at night just fine without that name being there. So, David, that kind of ties to what you're talking about. So I had that opportunity to work with him on that. There's more I can talk about the baseball disabled list, injured list. I can get to that one later if we will. But Amy, I want you to go ahead.
Mhm.
Mary, go ahead. That one's, you've mentioned it. Why not?
Well, let's stick with the UN convention piece,
All
because I
right.
think that's an interesting story. And
ordered that way. Yeah.
And I had an opportunity, Amy, to spend some time with you at the United Nations with Eli. And again, you couldn't plan on getting anywhere fast with Eli, because and it was astounding, actually, the conversations that would take place within, like a 20 meter walk. But again, let's talk, because that to me is just a great story too. And to Mary's point, you don't see his name anywhere on it, but yet it's a global initiative that now has global impact. And he was in many respects a real driver to it. Anyways, Amy, I'll pass it over to you.
Well, where you will see his name is around the advocacy to continue to get governments to implement it. So I was working at the International Paralympic Committee headquarters in Germany when the convention was being drafted. Eli and I were already friends, in touch. In fact, I had his now wife interning for me at that time as well. And I asked the CEO of the International Paralympic Committee if I could be engaged in the drafting process as well. And so they started sending me to the meetings. And so it was Eli, myself, and a person named Elise Roy, who would sit at the table most often. And now you have to understand Article 30 is much broader, as Mary said, than sport. It touches on other aspects of life. And so it was interesting, his patience, his unending patience of saying, well, sport has to be there and sport has to be more, at least half. And we respect culture and all these other pieces, but sport has to be there, and recreation and play. And so we all had our different interests. I was there on behalf of the Paralympics, but we got, and Mary, Eli must have been consulting with you the whole time, and I wouldn't even know it. I mean, I feel like Eli he probably had his little tentacles out, his network, and, getting feedback constantly. But in the drafting room at the end, there was a risk that all of the 0.5, which is all of the sport, recreation, and play, would be completely cut. And Eli was one of the most vocal people to keep it, and why. And with, channeling Mary's voice and probably a couple others, he knew what to say and how to say it. And it was a real pivotal moment for me in my relationship with him, because you basically have to do this silently. This is all silent work. This is meeting with governments It's all of the intergovernmental work that the UN does, which I'm still involved with, where you don't even really say your name, and it doesn't matter who you're representing. It's just you convincing someone that something has to be there. And at the end of the day, everybody who was part of the drafting knew him, knew who he was, and just was afraid to say no to Eli. And so it got passed as it is, as you can see today. But it didn't stop there. He would make sure that so in June of every year, you have a conference of state parties, which is when all the governments come together that have ratified the convention to say what they're doing and to meet and convene on certain topics. It still happens every year. And Eli would make sure that there was a side event every year that would look back at 30.5. And his name is on those records. He's leading it, he's organizing it, he's speaking at it, whatever. There was always a side event that Eli was involved with or hosting. And it also led to his work with the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace. And somewhere in the mix of all that is the work that is him being present as the body of work that we know today as sport for development became more formalized in the early 2000s, which is exactly when the drafting was happening on the convention, was when sport for development, when Magligan became something. Now, many of you are Canadians and you'll know Right to Play is older than 2000, but Right to Play was doing most of this on its own. And so there were these Magligan conferences that Eli and I would see each other at, and where it became formalized. The UN became involved. A UN Office of Sport was developed. Eli was always involved with their activities. So just to say, there's a lot around the UN and sport that Eli touched, the convention being a big part of it. And I will just reiterate something some people know, which is the day he passed was the International Day of Sport for Development and Peace, I think. Yeah. And that morning was the webinar that he was supposed to be organizing for hundreds of advocates around the world. And Eli, in true fashion, did it all as a one-man show. He knew what to do. He could do it. He was poised. He was organized. He had it all together. And then the irony was no one could get into his account to email the participants to say that it wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And so we all just were able to think dearly about him as they were supposed to be convening around sport for development. I'll pause there. Sorry.
Thank you, Amy. Mary, maybe let's go back to the conversations that we had about sport. And you talked about, and I'm thinking more on the high performance side. So you talked about Casey Martin and the PG and the Professional Golfers Association and some of the changes now that have been impacted on it. But let's talk about your favorite sport, baseball, and some of the impacts that he's had on that. And again, like, it really is fascinating to me, the breadth of touch points that he had throughout the entire umbrella of sport and recreation and physical activity. But let's talk a little bit about the impact on baseball.
Yeah, and he was not particularly a baseball guy. He was totally a soccer guy. Major League Baseball, of course, is the highest level of the professional league in the United States, and also we had the Toronto Blue Jays, of course, in Canada. But Major League Baseball, just like other of what we call the Big Four, the National Football League, National Basketball Association, of course, the National Hockey League, when a player gets injured or hurt and they're pulled from the roster, they're put on a list. Okay, their name is put on a list. And most organizations, most of those leagues, call it either the injured list or the injured reserve or injured reserve list, except for Major League Baseball. For years, really since the early 1900s, baseball called it the disabled list. So if you were hurt, you were put on the disabled list. Well, we didn't have it. It wasn't so much a problem with the word disabled, using the word disabled, but people who were on the disabled list weren't necessarily disabled. They were injured. You see, and there's a difference, right? And what does it mean to be disabled? And can a disabled person not play sport? Well, of course we know they can. But Eli and I talked about this again because I have a great interest in baseball. I even teach a management of professional baseball class. And he sort of got the ball rolling. And we wrote a letter to the then commissioner of Major League Baseball and said, hey, what about this? What about considering a name change? Well, whether or not you follow it, Baseball now calls it the injured list. It used to be the disabled list, I think 2 years ago or 3 years ago. Now they changed it. But it took us 15 years. 15 years, and we still have, and I have a copy of it, of course, from Eli does as well, of that initial letter that we sent 15 years ago, asking for it to be considered. We got a nice letter back. Thank you so much. It sounds like a great idea. Talk to you later. Okay. So, and what eventually happened was Eli, through his connections, what we were missing was, there's with these sport organizations or any of these international organizations, there are different levels of orbits, right, of people around the core. We were never really in that inside orbit with Major League Baseball until a guy came along called Billy Beane, and he is now where he worked and he got hired into the Major League Baseball executive offices in New York as sort of their vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And through Eli's connection with Billy Beane, it probably took him a few months once he got there to make it happen. And with the help of, I know there was an advocacy group out of Boston that helped us as well. And it happened, but it took 15 years. So the idea that Eli knew that change could happen, but he and I often jokingly called it that change happens at the speed of advocacy, which is pretty darn slow. And we sometimes, he and I even for a few years had like a little mascot that we would back and forth, we would emoji it, to each other, and that was a turtle. Okay, we know the story of the tortoise and the hare. So anyway, so now when you hear the injured list, you know that part of the story.
And for those of you who don't know Eli personally, you might be wondering how did he do kind of all these different things? And he had a variety of kind of appointments. And Mary and Amy, correct me if I'm wrong. So I know he was based at Northeastern in Boston for a number of years, but then he also had an appointment at Brown University, which is where he went to school, if I recall correctly. And then I think the most recent one was at the University of Connecticut at UConn. Yeah. And a lot of people, I think, assumed that he was a full faculty member. But they were teaching appointments that were at universities where he was also an administrator and an advocate. And I think it allowed him to kind of play in all these different pockets as it relates to management, advocacy, and research. And my understanding was that he did his master's at the Sport University in Cologne, Germany. And I think he had plans to even pursue a PhD there soon in the coming years, but that didn't take place. But just to kind of give people a little bit of context as to kind of the roles and where he was founded as he was doing all these things. Did I miss anything? Was there a piece that I missed in that story?
No, I think you that I can recall. He had Amy hit the highlights.
No, I don't remember. I mean, he worked, even though he had appointments at different places, he was very much a self, guided soul. And so he had the Power of Sport Lab and all of those other entities, he would basically define a group or define a project, and that was his place. Some people need academia to ground them. Some people need private sector or a public sector, but he just needed himself and a computer, and he would find his way. He didn't really need that big job title or big connection to make change.
He did. And Amy, also, I think in some ways he liked it better that way. He really liked the idea of being neutral and not being too attached to one side or the other when it came. I mean, he had his advocacy, but to particular organizations, that idea of remaining neutral but allowing the organization to make change. He was crafty at that, really good.
Well, and let's I want to come back to that point, but I want to finish up on the kind of the pro sports side of things, and as it relates to ESPN and the ESPYs. And I always got a kick out of him because, again, he would name drop like, well, I was talking to LeBron James, and I'm like, what? So I don't know, Amy or Mary, are you either of you better situated to talk about kind of his role with the ESPYs and the creation of an ESPY award?
Amy, I think you just got back from there this summer. Maybe.
I mean, but I don't know the history
Oh, the
that
history.
well.
Okay.
I'll just say that I was at the ESPYs this summer with his wife, and they honored him. And they recognized the pivotal role that Eli played. He was the one that convinced them to create an award for athletes with disability, and that will continue in his honor and on. And there was a real gap this year, I think, without him being there, because he was so pivotal in helping
Yeah.
ESPN understand who are the key players in this sector. But I have to tell you, I can't remember how it started. Can you, Mary?
Yeah, well, you know, being an athlete and knowing what the ESPYs were, he just saw that something was missing, and that, you know, athletes with disabilities who would be, you know, of that status to win an ESPY there was no avenue for them to be recognized, and so came up with the idea of establishing ESPYs for the best female athlete with a disability and the best male athlete with a disability. So that's how it got started. And he was able to talk to he was, again, able to find the right people at ESPN to talk to make it happen. And it took a while before it did happen. And even now, so we see those, you know, those awards now, but we also see where there are some athletes with disabilities who get nominated for the typical ESPYs as well. And not only, you know, pigeonholed into the awards for athletes with disabilities, but that would never have happened without first establishing those other awards and establishing the legitimacy. We know it, those of us in the disability sport world know it, but to those outside of it, establishing their legitimacy as the athletes that they are.
And I'll just point out that they're now a combined gender, you know, it's one award. So if anyone's looking for a project of an advocacy project and wishes it to be separate, there you go. It's now combined.
There's still some work to be done. There's still opportunities to get involved. We could spend some time talking about kind of the connection to the IOC and Principle 6 and the Olympian Paralympian conversation, but I'm cognizant of time, and I've also I want to provide Eli's mom, who's joining us here today, an opportunity to speak, but we'll do that maybe towards the end. And we've talked about Eli's wife a couple times now, but we haven't named her. So Dr. Sherry Blauette, who is not able to join us today, but is going to watch the recording of this, and herself is a highly decorated Paralympian and an accomplished individual in her own regard, let alone in working with Eli on a number of initiatives. But I just wanted to make sure that we acknowledged her as well. Before I pass it over to Eli's mom to kind of talk a little bit about Eli and what he was like as a young man, I wanted to just ask Mary and Amy, like, what can we do? You know, like, again, the Calgary Adaptive Hub powered by Jumpstart is doing a very small thing by, you know, naming our seminar series in Eli's honor and trying to continue on with his, you know, the ethos and the passion of advocacy and trying to do the right things. But what else can be done to ensure that his legacy continues and in his memory?
Well, I know one thing that's happening in the academic community is the North American Society for Sports Sociology is going to be establishing an award, I guess a scholarship type award for someone who's in that area that's studying disability sport or advocacy, sport and human rights, whatever it might be. And what that is going to do is, because it's in an academic-based organization, it's going to give young academics the opportunity to say that, hey, this work is valued. You know, for a long time, work on disability sport, particularly in sport management, was not really, it was very small. It wasn't that, I don't want to say valued, but there wasn't that much of it. The North American Society for Sports Sociology, of course, has embraced it, I think, more than we have in sport management. But the establishment of that scholarship, that now is going to live on. And it's going to have his name, and because it's going to be given to someone in academia, who then is going to have the opportunity to teach students about this area. See how that goes on and on. See, and that is legacy. That is a form of legacy. So I'll throw that one in.
Thanks, Mary.
Yeah,
Amy.
So generally, the way to live by Eli's legacy is to see something and say something. When you see something out of place, just, you might think it's crazy, but try and change it. That is how he started all of the big things that he did. He simply saw something out of place, as Mary said, and wanted to advocate until it was done. And crafty, slow and steady,
Yeah.
meticulous. All of these words are the way and the process of which he was able to get things done. But I encourage people, if you want to be like Eli, you want to find the outlier and try and bring it in, and try and create more inclusive approaches. Very practically, Mary and I are trying to continue his legacy by advocating with the International Olympic Committee to include disability in the non-discrimination clause, which is Principle 6 of the Olympic Charter. We have a call next week with them. It doesn't look great right now, but we aren't going to stop. The Olympic Board is supposed to meet next month, and we'll be reviewing the charter, and it doesn't look like they will be reviewing this piece. If things change, great, but if not, and you want to join our advocacy, it looks like we will probably move forward with a letter, of which Eli collected over 100 signatures before he passed. It's a letter in support of changing the Olympic Charter. If you'd like to join that, you can reach out to one of us, or David can support that process. So that advocacy will continue, because until the day that they mention disability in the charter, we have work to do. I'll leave it with that.
So I'm recognizing the time, and Janice has offered, very courageously and kindly offered, to speak about Eli as a young person and his moral compass, and perhaps kind of how he developed into the person that he was. So Janice, I'll pass it over to you, and thank you very much for joining us and being willing to speak with us this afternoon.
Okay, I'm in Boston now, where I lived for a while. Lived in a lot of places, and have even gone, my husband and I joined the Peace Corps when we were 50. So we've been have quite a lot of experience running around the world. And Eli's older brother lives in Berlin. But I want to tell a story. When Eli was 12, he was in 7th grade. And on a Friday afternoon, I picked him up from school, and he got in the car and just slammed his books down on the seat and said, "I'm so mad." And I'm sure you all can kind of hear that in a 12-year-old Eli. And he described that there had been an assembly at school that afternoon that what he called was about handicaps, which is a language that is not used, and he wasn't using it then. And he said that there on the stage, there was someone who was supposed to be blind, who was not, someone who was supposed to not be able to walk, but could, and someone who was supposedly couldn't hear, but could. So I said, and I just listened to him because he was on a roll, and he said, "I'm going to write my own assembly." I'm telling you what his voice was like. I'm driving, he's sitting in the back. I said, "Okay, let me know if you need any." Well, 2 weeks later, the whole thing had been organized. He basically was going to tell his story about, some of you may not know, but he had a stroke 4 days out of a fairly typical heart surgery that was obviously not great for the family, but he just made lemonade out of that lemon and carried on. So he gathered a couple of his friends together, and he had this assembly that a lot of people came to, a lot of people in Washington, D.C., where we were. We just invited them all. And he had everyone say different things. But what was most poignant about that assembly is at the very end, and a lot of these were classmates, he handed out an orange to everyone in the audience. Now, if Eli had a stroke and his left hand was not as useful as ours is, and he said to the audience, "Peel this orange with one hand." It was very powerful. He basically took what was inside of him and gave a gift to the rest of us. So, and there are many stories following, but I wanted to share that one.
That's a great story. I've not heard that story before. Thank you for sharing that. We have a few minutes remaining, and so Amy and Mary, I want to provide you with any opportunity to kind of share a thought of Eli. And Janice, I don't want to discount an opportunity for you to share other thoughts about Eli too. But Mary and Amy, are there any kind of closing comments or thoughts about who Eli was and how we can continue on ensuring that his contributions and his efforts are not for naught, and continue moving forward?
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would say is I miss him still every day. We would text each other. I still expect my phone to ping and have it to be Eli, because we would be in contact very frequently. Live a life of inclusion. Be remembered by who you included as opposed to who you excluded. I think that's how Eli lived his life. Everybody had value. Everybody had dignity. You see, he lived a life where just because you were human, you were entitled to the respect and dignity that was owed any human being, anybody, no exceptions. That's what a beautiful way to live.
Mm-hmm.
And what a beautiful lesson that he taught everyone. He was accepting. He was without judgment. He had his moments, don't we all? Of course. But he taught us all, and he modeled that for all of us to live an inclusive life. And that I don't know how else to say it. I guess I would leave it at that. And I would say, thank you, Eli.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for doing that for everybody that you met.
Thanks, Mary.
You're welcome.
Amy?
I think I already gave some thoughts about how to continue his legacy. I'll just make a note that he always said, do it for the love. It was something we all shared across the Paralympic movement. A lot of athletes share it. I hope everyone can take it today as a calling. Just do it for the love, be inclusive, and be like Eli. That's it.
Thank you, Amy. I'll conclude and I'll stay online for as long as people wish to have any comments or to leave any lasting memories. Mary, sorry, did you want to say?
I was pointing, like you could tell, at Janice. I don't know if there was anything else that.
Yeah, Janice. Yeah, any concluding comments or thoughts or stories you wanted to share with us too?
There are a lot of stories, but the various comments today really speak about who he was. He was really driven something very deep and internal from the time I met him at his birth, pretty much.
Pretty much, yeah.
His older brother is somewhat similar. He's a jazz musician in Berlin and decided to go somewhere as he said, so I only have to have one job. He's been there 3 years now. So I had two sons who are really artists. And really, I just watched them emerge into amazing people. It's a big loss for all of us to not have Eli here.
Mm-hmm. So. Agreed. Well said. So thank you, Amy. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Janice, for speaking today about our friend Eli and the contributions that he made. From this point forward, the seminar series will be named and known as the Calgary Adapted Hub seminar series in memory of Eli Wolff. He was a very good friend of mine. I still have an email in my inbox from him that I will likely never delete. It will just sit there in my inbox and as a reminder to me of him. He was a true prince of a man, just in every aspect. And I miss him professionally, but I think I miss him more personally. Just as someone I just enjoyed spending time with, even though he lived on the other side of the country. And it was perhaps once every few years when I actually saw him physically. But he was someone who I will hold in my heart with a great amount of respect and esteem and just love. So thank you to those of you who joined us today for spending time with us and helping us celebrate a life well lived. I will formally close this and stop recording. And again, we will share this online for others if they wish to watch and to kind of share and learn about Eli's contributions.